Hey everyone! Tonight, we're diving into the strange, ambitious, and occasionally eyebrowless world of medieval beauty standards. A world where the aim wasn't to look healthy, but to look like someone who'd just calmly fainted from exertion. Before you settle in, take a second to like this video and subscribe, but only if you're actually enjoying the content. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. It's always fun to see how far and wide this audience stretches. Now dim the lights, maybe click on a fan for that soft white noise, and let's sink into tonight's story together. In the medieval world, having pale skin wasn't a sign you needed more rest. It was a fashion choice, a status symbol, a quiet announcement to everyone around you that said, "I am far too wealthy to ever set foot in sunlight. Thank you very much." Unlike today, where a sun-kissed glow might suggest yoga, smoothies, or a beach getaway, medieval beauty worked in reverse. A tan meant outdoor labor, which meant poverty, which meant, gasp, actual physical work. And nothing screamed unattractive in the 14th century, quite like knowing how to milk a cow. So the paler your skin, the higher your assumed rank in society. And when they said pale, they didn't mean a soft ivory tone. They meant nearly translucent, almost see-through skin with visible veins beneath. The kind of complexion that made you look like you'd just seen a ghost, or perhaps were one yourself. Naturally, biology doesn't always cooperate, especially when you're stuck with a functioning circulatory system. So people gave nature a hand. Noble women, and occasionally noblemen, dusted their faces with white lead powder, which delivered that coveted corpse-like sheen while quietly poisoning them in the process. But beauty has always demanded sacrifice. Some soaked cloths in vinegar and pressed them against their skin to bleach it. Others mixed crushed pearls with egg whites, a combination that lightened the complexion while leaving cheeks with the texture of a day-old omelet. Some even painted fake blue veins onto their arms and chest to suggest fragility, because apparently nothing signals nobility quite like pretending your skin is on the verge of splitting open. Literature joined the trend too. Love poems described women as pale as milk, white as snow, and in one memorable case, as pale as the winter moon, which is really just a poetic way of saying she looked like she might collapse. This obsession with pallor wasn't only about looks. It was code for class, purity, and total detachment from farm labor. If you could afford to look breakable, you were winning. Achieving that prized ghostly complexion in the Middle Ages usually meant more than good genetics. It meant a slow, decorative brush with chemical poisoning. When nature alone wasn't enough, people turned to lead-based white face powder. Yes, the same substance we now cordon off in old buildings. Back then, though, it was considered the height of innovation. It gave the skin a flat, pale, matte finish. Essentially, the medieval version of full-coverage foundation, leaving the face looking flawless, and eventually feeling anything but. This powder was made by exposing metal to vinegar until it corroded into a white residue, which was then ground down into a fine dust. Apply it daily, and you'd achieve the look of a radiant aristocrat quietly signing up for a slow death. If your skin started peeling, blistering, or flaking away in small chunks, that was, somehow, taken as a sign the product was working. And the routine rarely stopped there. Many layered on mercury-based rouge for color, or chalk powder to help the base stick longer. Egg whites were smoothed over the face for extra shine. Basically, if it came from a barn or an alchemist's shelf, chances are someone had rubbed it on their face in pursuit of elegance. Beyond the obvious poisoning, lead cosmetics caused chronic exhaustion, skin sores, hair loss, and early death, none of which appear on modern skincare packaging. Yet the trend persisted, because when the alternative was being mistaken for a commoner, many nobles apparently preferred the slow route to the grave. Men weren't entirely exempt either. Some male courtiers, particularly in the later medieval and early Renaissance courts, used powders and skin treatments of their own. In eras where appearance mattered nearly as much as bloodline, or at least as much as smelling better than one's rivals. Of all the medieval beauty obsessions, the fixation on tall foreheads might be the most eyebrow-raising, quite literally, since people were plucking their eyebrows out entirely to achieve it. A tall, smooth, uninterrupted forehead wasn't just trendy. It was seen as elegant, intelligent, and even divine. The architectural centerpiece of a noble face. That kind of forehead announced, "I spend my time reading scripture and gazing thoughtfully from castle windows, not swinging a shovel." To reach this look, women went to extreme and often itchy lengths. Eyebrows were plucked away completely, and sometimes hair along the scalp was removed strand by strand to push the hairline further back. This wasn't a simple trim. It was a full forehead expansion campaign. Beauty guides of the era recommended tweezers, hot cloths, and depilatory pastes made from ingredients like cat dung, quicklime, or vinegar-soaked leeches, all in pursuit of a forehead spacious enough to host a jousting match. The results were unmistakable. Portraits from the period show women with calm expressions and foreheads so expansive. They seemed to stretch endlessly. Paired with pale skin and delicate features, this high forehead look became a visual shorthand for refinement. Fashion supported the trend too. Fitted hoods, wimples, and those iconic cone-shaped henna hats all helped pull hair back or hide the spot where eyebrows used to be. This wasn't limited to one region. From England to France to Italy, noblewomen embraced the tall forehead aesthetic, while poets and painters praised faces that seemed to begin near the crown of the head. Not everyone had the time or resources to pluck their way to perfection, though. Some women simply painted a higher hairline onto their skin and covered the rest with headbands or veils. In other words, the Middle Ages had their own version of contouring. It just required a great deal more fabric. In medieval Europe, eyebrows weren't just overlooked. They were deliberately erased. While modern beauty culture celebrates thick, sculpted brows and endless online tutorials, in the 14th and 15th centuries, eyebrows were treated as unwanted facial clutter. To hit the ideal look, women plucked their brows down to almost nothing, or removed them entirely. The reasoning was simple. A smooth, bare forehead was considered graceful, and any stray hairs disrupted that clean look. Eyebrows were essentially treated like weeds sprouting in an otherwise manicured garden. Some women went even further, shaving the brow area completely to guarantee not a single hair interrupted their pale, glowing forehead. It's the kind of dedication that would make today's beauty influencers pause, especially since there were no eyebrow pencils around to fix any regrets. Removal methods included tweezers, pumice stones, wax, or, for the truly daring, pastes containing quicklime, vinegar, or even arsenic. Nothing quite says commitment to a look like risking chemical burns to your face. This wasn't a fleeting trend either. Illuminated manuscripts and oil paintings from the era consistently show noble women with smooth foreheads and expressionless eyes, framed by nothing but bare skin. A look that reads as either serene or faintly unsettling depending on the lighting. Interestingly, the trend wasn't uniform across all of Europe. In some regions, thin or lightly arched brows remained in fashion, especially where Byzantine and Middle Eastern influences filtered in through trade and conflict. But broadly speaking, the message was clear. Visible eyebrows meant you were doing it wrong. Men occasionally groomed or trimmed their brows too, particularly those in courtly circles, though full removal was rare among them unless lost during some particularly intense theological argument. What all this reveals is that medieval beauty wasn't about looking natural. It was about looking deliberate, symbolic, and faintly angelic. After all, angels in religious art rarely have eyebrows. Coincidence, maybe, but it worked in their favor. A touch of color on the cheeks was desirable in medieval times. But as with everything else in medieval life, there were rules, risks, and a faint chance of spiritual condemnation attached. The ideal was a soft, natural-looking blush, as if you'd just heard a slightly scandalous poem or briefly stepped outside, but not long enough to actually tan. A gentle rosy tint suggested youth, fertility, and general good health, all appealing qualities, particularly if maintained past the ripe old age of 28. The catch was that you couldn't look like you were trying. Wearing rouge was seen as vain, and vanity sat uncomfortably close to sin. The church wasn't thrilled about women adding color to their faces, unless, of course, they were nobility, or managed to do it with enough humility. A theological loophole scholars still debate. Still, women found ways around it. Common blush ingredients included beetroot juice, crushed strawberries, mulberries, or a deep red dye made from crushed insects. Yes, actual bugs, because beauty routines have never been squeamish. Some simply rubbed their cheeks to bring blood to the surface, while others dabbed on red ochre or wine sediment carefully, hoping to avoid the notice of both clergy and gossiping neighbors. Wealthier women had access to rouge made from red lead or cinnabar, both dangerously toxic, but the mindset seemed to be better to die young with rosy cheeks and social approval intact. Rouge was applied with cloth, fingers, or whatever tool happened to be nearby that hadn't just been used for cooking. Mirrors were scarce. So many relied on instinct, muscle memory, or an honest servant's opinion. Of course, if the blush looked too obvious, you risked being compared to a courtesan, or worse, a French courtier. The goal was always subtle enhancement, never a dramatic statement. And if anyone complimented your glow, proper etiquette demanded you deny it and blame the weather. Even nuns occasionally wore a hint of rouge, reportedly reserved for feast days only, because nothing says devotion to God quite like a tasteful smear of beetroot juice behind convent walls. In medieval Europe, if your hair didn't look like it had been touched by heavenly light or bottled from an angel, you were already behind. Blonde hair especially was treated as the beauty gold standard, tied to notions of youth, virtue, and conveniently, divine approval. The Virgin Mary was frequently painted as blonde, despite this being geographically improbable, but visual symbolism mattered more than historical accuracy. Being born blonde was considered a blessing, and probably earned you a pass on a few chores. But natural blonde tends to darken with age, so medieval women took the matter into their own hands, sometimes literally boiling concoctions in cauldrons. Homemade lightening mixtures included saffron, chamomile, wood ash, honey, and lye, applied generously and left to bake in direct sunlight, a method sometimes called sun bleaching. It worked best if you had the patience of a monk and skin tough as leather. Some recipes even called for urine, believed to help lift the color, whose urine exactly was left unspecified. But as long as it delivered that golden shimmer, it was considered worth it. Beauty, it turns out, has always come with a slightly gross side. Hair texture mattered as well. Long, loose, wavy hair was the ideal, flowing down the back like a divine curtain. But this style was reserved exclusively for unmarried women. Once married, that golden hair had to be tucked away under veils, nets, and wraps, as though marriage instantly transformed hair into classified information. Noble women often wore their hair in elaborate braids or twists for court appearances or religious events, decorated with ribbons, beads, or embroidery, just in case anyone forgot they weren't shearing sheep for a living. Men weren't left entirely out of the beauty conversation either. Those with thick, golden hair were often romanticized in poetry and art, with knights sporting flowing locks into battle, serving as the medieval equivalent of a shampoo commercial. In medieval Europe, hair functioned a lot like wealth. something you didn't flaunt unless you were trying to attract a spouse, at which point it suddenly became a valuable asset. Unmarried women were encouraged to keep their hair long and loose as a symbol of purity, though not too loose, unless you were channeling some ethereal forest maiden vibe, which was really only acceptable if you happened to be a literal saint or on your way to martyrdom. Otherwise, a simple braid did the job. Once married, though, hair vanished from public view almost overnight. Congratulations! You now had a husband and an obligation to keep your hair more tightly wrapped than a monastery's finances. Enter veils, wimples, hairnets, and coifs. A whole wardrobe of modesty capable of hiding even the most striking blonde under multiple layers of plain linen. These coverings weren't purely symbolic. They also protected hair from smoke, lice, and unwanted flattery from traveling poets. The most devoted women layered their headwear extensively. A snug coif might sit beneath a veil, which itself might be pinned under a wimple wrapped tightly around the chin. The end effect was, admittedly, a well-bundled and very devout-looking sandwich. But that was exactly the point. Fashion, however, rarely stays purely practical. Over time, headwear grew more ornate. Hairnets were stitched with gold thread. Veils were stiffened into geometric shapes. And some noblewomen even wore jeweled, bell-adorned cages over their braids, ensuring they announced their presence with a gentle jingle wherever they walked. In many cultures, covered hair symbolized morality. A properly veiled head signaled virtue, while an exposed married woman's hair invited comparisons to scandalous behavior, or worse, being mistaken for French. Naturally, some women rebelled quietly, letting a curl slip free or wearing sheer veils that technically counted as covered, while still showing off carefully dyed strands underneath. Medieval loopholes were alive and well. If there was one unwritten rule of medieval beauty, it was this: taller equals nobler. And this time, we're not talking about height in the literal sense of legs. By the 1400s, women across Europe had embraced a striking new trend: the hennin, those towering, cone-shaped headpieces that look as though they were designed by someone who spent way too much time staring at cathedral spires. The hennin wasn't merely a hat. It functioned as a literal social ladder worn on the head. Some of these structures reached heights of 2 feet or more, particularly among French and Burgundian elites. The taller the hennin, the higher the wearer's perceived status and, presumably, the more door frames she accidentally collided with on her way to dinner. Typically crafted from fine silk, velvet, or brocade and shaped using wire frames, hennins had a dramatic, almost aerodynamic silhouette. A sheer veil usually trailed from the peak, adding a flowing, mysterious effect, and a high risk of catching fire near candles. Fitting one's hair beneath such a structure was its own challenge. Hair was often braided and tucked up inside the cone, or the forehead was shaved back once again to help the hat sit properly. Comfort clearly wasn't a design priority. Hennins weren't the only extravagant headwear option. Either, some women wore heart-shaped styles resembling 2 crescent rolls stuck to either side of the head, while others chose butterfly-style veils spread wide like wings. Dramatic, but not exactly rain-friendly. Outside noble circles, most women wore simpler linen caps, veils or circlets, safer, and far less likely to be mistaken for siege equipment. Predictably, clergy and conservative voices were unimpressed, warning that such extravagant headgear invited vanity, sin, and possibly neck strain. Still, hennins remained popular among those who could afford them, much like most impractical but fashionable trends throughout history. And while men never adopted towering cones themselves, they had their own statement pieces: feathered hats, fur-lined hoods, and pointed shoes sharp enough to double as fencing gear. In medieval times, the ideal female figure wasn't athletic, curvy, or toned. Instead, the goal was to appear delicate, demure, and perpetually on the verge of a graceful feint. Beauty manuals of the era certainly didn't recommend building strength or stamina. The only lifting expected of a noblewoman was raising her veil in a flirtatious gesture before quickly looking away, maybe followed by a well-timed swoon. Still, the goal wasn't to appear outright sickly. The sweet spot lay somewhere between too frail to lift a bucket and capable of playing the lute while seated gracefully. A slim, willowy body was linked to nobility, since manual labor produced broader shoulders, stronger arms, and, heaven forbid, visible muscle tone. The emphasis was on a narrow waist, soft curves, and a subtle air of spiritual fatigue. Dresses were often cinched just below the bust, an early precursor to the empire waistline, designed to elongate the torso and create the illusion of height and fragility. If additional shaping was needed, tight lacing on gowns and undergarments, not quite true corsets, which came later, did the trick. That said, being too thin wasn't the goal either. During times of famine or plague, extreme thinness raised concern rather than admiration. It suggested you might actually be dying. A slight softness, particularly around the face or hips, was seen as a sign of health and fertility. Essentially, if you looked capable of surviving a harsh winter while still appearing poetic and delicate, you'd hit the ideal. Dietary advice from the period wasn't exactly nutritionally sound. Beauty guides suggested fennel for digestion, rose petals to freshen breath, and wine to improve complexion. Protein was acceptable mostly if it still had feathers attached. Men, meanwhile, were permitted a bit more physical presence. Broad shoulders, strong legs, the ability to wield a sword without toppling over. Though nobility still favored a lean build and refined posture over raw strength. In the Middle Ages, a woman's eyes carried quiet influence, essentially the medieval version of a flirtatious glance, minus the emojis, and with considerably more spiritual weight attached. The ideal eyes were large, clear, and soulful. The kind that seemed to silently say, "I am full of virtue," and perhaps a touch of melancholy. Poets described them as if they'd witnessed humanity's fall from grace and were still quietly processing it. Verses compared eyes to glowing orbs, dewdrops from heaven, or pools of devotion, rarely, if ever, describing them as bloodshot, allergy-strained, or exhausted from a night spent churning butter. In Northern Europe, light-colored eyes, blue or gray, were often idealized, tied to notions of innocence and purity, or at least the appearance of not having witnessed anything too troubling. In Southern Europe, darker eyes were equally admired, especially when paired with noble lineage and a respectable dowry. Enhancing the eyes wasn't easy in an age without eyeliner pens. People relied on charcoal, soot, and a fair amount of optimism. Some women lightly dabbed dark powder around their lashes to make eyes appear larger, risking irritation, blurred vision, or accidentally inventing an early version of the smoky eye. Most, however, leaned on natural techniques and clever lighting, standing near candlelight to appear more wide-eyed, or gazing downward to project modesty, even while tripping over the household cat. Interestingly, slightly teary eyes were considered attractive too, hinting at emotional depth, piety, or the appearance of having just finished praying, or reading an extremely long poem about chastity. Since artificial tears didn't exist, staring into smoke or enduring mild embarrassment in public usually did the job. Eye contact itself required careful calibration. Too direct, and you risked appearing bold or flirtatious, or suspiciously French. Too little, and you seemed evasive or unsettling. The trick was an occasional glance upward from lowered lids, like someone who had memorized scripture but had no interest in bragging about it. Let's talk about something rarely mentioned in medieval love poetry: breath. While a knight might eloquently praise his lady's rosebud lips or pearl-white teeth, poems conveniently skipped over what those lips smelled like when opened. That's because medieval dental hygiene was, at best, an aspiration. And minty freshness hadn't been invented yet, unless standing near an herb garden counted. Even so, pleasant breath was technically valued, signaling youth, health, and the unlikely possibility that you hadn't just eaten garlic and eel for breakfast, even though, statistically, you probably had. Medieval women did what they could, chewing parsley, fennel seeds, cloves, cinnamon sticks, or the occasional twig, less for flavor and more to keep the mouth tolerable. Consider it an early, less minty ancestor of chewing gum. It didn't whiten teeth, but it made close conversations slightly less alarming. Those with access to apothecaries could also find herbal pastes and rinses made from sage, vinegar, and myrrh used sparingly, both due to cost and because opening your mouth too widely in public was frowned upon. Toothbrushing, as we understand it today, wasn't standard practice. Instead, people wiped their teeth with cloth, scrubbed with chalk or crushed herbs, or chewed on small fibrous sticks that doubled as fidget tools while enduring another suitor's overwrought poetry. Bad breath wasn't exactly considered romantic, but it also wasn't shocking. Nearly everyone dealt with it to some degree, and people generally had bigger concerns, like surviving winter or avoiding accusations of heresy. For noble women, the strategy was simply minimizing offense while maintaining composure. Conversations happened at a careful distance, public affection was limited, and when in doubt, fanning oneself while looking thoughtfully distant was always an option. Bonus points: if you carried a small pomander, a scented ball filled with herbs, waved discreetly in your own direction as needed. Today, a great smile might launch 1,000 dating app matches. In the Middle Ages, smiling widely was a calculated risk, best used sparingly, like spices or public uprisings. The reason comes down to dental hygiene, which wasn't exactly a strong suit of the era. Teeth mattered, sure, but mostly for chewing bread rather than charming potential suitors. Most people's teeth ranged from mildly questionable to genuinely alarming by the time they hit 30, so the general strategy was to show them as little as possible. This wasn't purely due to neglect. Tooth decay was rampant, driven by diets heavy in bread, porridge, and mead, and completely lacking toothbrushes, floss, or fluoride. Sugar wasn't widely available across most of Europe yet, but even basic starches wreaked havoc on enamel. And dental treatment at the time was essentially minor surgery performed with pliers and a prayer. Despite all this, a healthy smile was quietly admired, just not loudly celebrated. Straight, white teeth were rare enough to be seen as a mark of good fortune, even something close to miraculous. But no one was walking around flashing wide grins like a medieval toothpaste ad. Instead, a closed-lip, restrained smile was far more fashionable. The vibe was less thrilled to be here, and more quietly contemplating a sonnet. Some women used powders made from sage, salt, or crushed coral in an attempt to clean or whiten their teeth. Mildly effective, but mostly just abrasive, essentially brushing with sand and hoping for the best. For the most part, though, teeth were tolerated rather than showcased. Medieval artwork rarely depicts open-mouthed smiles. Even saints and angels are typically shown with closed lips, as if they too understood the risks of revealing too much. Men weren't spared from these standards either. A knight might win a lady's admiration through bravery and a sharp jawline, but no love ballad ever praised gleaming teeth. Poets sang of eyes, hair, and hands, but rarely breath or bite alignment. Medieval beauty expectations for men were oddly specific. You didn't need to look like a Greek statue, but you also couldn't appear as though you'd just tumbled off a hay cart. The ideal sat somewhere between ready to joust and capable of writing a poem about jousting without actually doing it. A desirable man was tall, lean, broad-shouldered, and, crucially, effortlessly noble. Too much visible muscle suggested manual labor. Too little suggested laziness or excessive comfort. The goal was to look capable of swinging a sword, provided the squire happened to be unavailable. A defined jaw, high cheekbones, and a straight nose were all considered attractive. Think prince from an illuminated manuscript rather than village blacksmith. Depending on the region and era, either a well-groomed beard or a clean-shaven face was acceptable. But either way, it needed to look intentional rather than accidental. Hair was typically worn shoulder length, especially among noblemen, and curls were fashionable in many courts, whether natural or carefully engineered. Some men even used heated curling rods or herbal rinses to enhance shine and texture, because nothing signals above manual labor, quite like sitting patiently while a page styles your hair. Clothing also played a major role in shaping the ideal male silhouette. Padded shoulders, cinched waists, and fitted tunics created the desired proportions, with posture playing an equally important part. A proper nobleman didn't slouch. He moved with an almost effortless air of superiority, and if a man happened to be naturally muscular, that was acceptable, provided he wasn't caught actually using those muscles for labor. Fighting in wars was noble. Hauling barrels was not. Above all, the look needed to appear effortless. You weren't supposed to try to be attractive. You were simply born that way, a kind of medieval version of natural charisma, minus the gym membership and plus an inherited estate and a trained falcon. In an era when bathing was more or less optional and indoor plumbing existed mostly as a distant fantasy, managing body odor became something of an art form, though closer to damage control than luxury. To be fair, people did bathe, just far less often than we'd probably like, with frequency depending heavily on the century, region, and whatever plague happened to be circulating. To keep from offending noses both earthly and divine, medieval men and women turned to the aromatic power of herbs, oils, and scented pouches. The pomander was central to this effort, a small hollow ball, often metal, worn on a chain or pinned to clothing, filled with strong-smelling herbs like clove, rosemary, cinnamon, sage, and a mysterious blend sometimes labeled powder of roses. These weren't just decorative. They functioned as portable odor barriers, essentially a medieval version of carrying a small air freshener wherever you went. Nobility also favored perfumed gloves, scented handkerchiefs, and fragranced combs. Nearly anything could be treated with scent, including hair, which was sometimes rinsed in floral water or vinegar infusions that, at the very least, smelled better than sweat and general despair. And yes, people absolutely did sweat. Medieval clothing was heavy, summers were hot, and deodorant was still centuries away from being invented. The workaround was layered linen, which absorbed moisture and could be washed far more often than the heavier wool or silk garments worn over it. Some tucked herbal sachets into their undergarments, hoping fragrance might outmatch odor. Bathhouses did exist, particularly in the early and later medieval periods, though access varied enormously, and eventually the church grew disapproving of communal bathing, putting something of a damper on hygiene enthusiasm. As a result, many turned to dry bathing, which is exactly as unrefreshing as it sounds, wiping down with a cloth, spritzing on scented water, and calling it good. And then there were the true overachievers, people who tucked flower petals into their shoes or stuffed herbs into their bedding, chasing the faint illusion of smelling like a garden. In medieval Europe, beauty wasn't just skin deep, it was morally loaded. A well-arranged face could be interpreted as a divine gift, a social advantage, or a trap set by the devil. Sometimes all three before breakfast. Being considered beautiful meant walking a precarious line. On one hand, physical beauty, clear skin, balanced features, a pale complexion, was seen as evidence of virtue. Attractiveness suggested you were blessed, perhaps favored by God, or at the very least unlikely to be a livestock thief. Poets, preachers, and painters alike treated beauty as proof of a pure soul. But there was a catch. If you were aware of your own beauty, or worse, actually used it to your advantage, suspicion followed immediately. Vanity was sinful, and taking too much interest in one's appearance hinted at pride, seduction, or, worst of all, behaving suspiciously French. Medieval sermons frequently warned that female beauty could lead men into temptation, a burden that, conveniently, always seemed to fall back on the woman. Eve set the precedent, and medieval Europe ran with that narrative for roughly 1,000 years. A woman wearing makeup, showing a bit of hair, or glancing the wrong way at the wrong moment could easily be labeled immoral, or even accused of witchcraft. Some genuinely believed that unusual beauty might be an illusion, a disguise conjured by a sorceress to lead righteous men astray. It sounds extreme now, but this was an era when bad weather alone could get someone burned at the stake. Conversely, those considered plain or unattractive were sometimes assumed to carry some hidden moral flaw, or were simply viewed as unlucky. The idea that outward appearance reflected inner character wasn't just a passing belief. In some circles, it functioned as near doctrine. Beauty implied grace, plainness implied punishment, illness or divine disapproval. All of this created a genuinely confusing set of expectations. Be attractive, but don't visibly try. Radiate virtue, but not so brightly that it looks like arrogance. And above all, never outshine the local lord's wife. A fast track to a quiet convent or a conveniently timed illness. In the end, medieval beauty standards weren't purely about looks. They were a delicate balancing act between vanity, virtue, and whatever leftover lead powder remained in your cosmetics kit. The Persian immortals were far more than an elite fighting force. They were a statement, a living emblem of imperial strength, precision, and unbroken continuity. Their story begins at the founding of the Achaemenid Empire under Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BCE. As Persia rapidly evolved from a regional power into a vast imperial force, Cyrus recognized something essential. An empire needs more than administrators and governors. It needs an elite unit capable of projecting dominance, inspiring loyalty, and crushing rebellion with equal efficiency. From that need, the Immortals emerged. The name Immortals wasn't simply poetic flourish. It reflected a deliberate logistical and psychological strategy. According to Herodotus, their ranks were kept at a constant 10,000 men. If a soldier died, fell ill, or was wounded, he was replaced immediately, keeping the total unchanged. From the outside, this created the impression that the unit could never be weakened, diminished, or destroyed. That, in effect, they simply didn't die. Whether myth, clever administration, or both, the image endured. Immortality here wasn't about any single soldier surviving forever. It was about the eternal presence of Persian military power. These weren't randomly conscripted soldiers. Becoming an immortal meant being chosen from Persian nobility, or at least from families with proven loyalty and status. Training began early, discipline was severe, and loyalty to the king was absolute. They were expected to embody not just combat skill, but the broader values of order, obedience, and composure. Their appearance reflected this too. Richly dressed in fine robes, layered with scale armor beneath, and armed with spears, bows, short swords, and wicker shields. Persian kings weren't merely deploying soldiers, they were sending a mobile political message dressed in silk and steel. From the plains of Lydia to the deserts of Egypt, wherever the empire expanded, the Immortals followed, standing beside thrones, behind kings, and at the front lines of battle. Seeing them approach wasn't just seeing soldiers, it was witnessing the steady heartbeat of an empire that didn't blink, didn't retreat, and simply endured. And that endurance is exactly what made them so unsettling to their enemies. Their appearance wasn't accidental. It was engineered psychological warfare. Unlike Greek hoplites, gleaming head to toe in bronze, the Immortals resembled a wave of richly dressed shadows sweeping across the battlefield. Their uniforms combined regal flair with military practicality. Elaborately embroidered tunics and trousers dyed in deep reds and purples. Colors associated with authority and command. Beneath this fabric lay flexible scale armor made of bronze or iron, light enough for mobility, yet effective in close combat. Their shields, woven from wicker, were surprisingly capable of deflecting arrows and absorbing blows despite their light weight. Perhaps their most distinctive feature was a soft felt cap known as a tiara, sometimes worn pulled across the face to obscure identity. Where the Greeks celebrated individual glory in their armor, the Immortals thrived on uniformity. 10,000 men moving almost silently, dressed and armed identically, creating a visual spectacle that overwhelmed anyone watching. It was less like facing an army and more like witnessing a curtain of inevitability descend across the field. Each soldier carried a short spear, a bow with a quiver of arrows, and a short sword or dagger at his belt. But their true strength lay in adaptability. Trained to move quickly and remain effective across nearly any terrain, marching entire provinces without breaking formation. Unlike many ancient forces, the Immortals functioned equally well in open combat or as ceremonial guards inside royal courts. Their gear balanced mobility with lethality, favoring consistency over raw strength, never faltering, never appearing vulnerable. That relentless consistency, combined with their mysterious appearance, is precisely what cemented their legend. When they advanced into battle, drums pounded and dust rose in their wake. Yet their expressions remained eerily calm. No shouting, no boasting, just synchronized, disciplined precision, as if they weren't men at all, but something forged entirely from ritual and discipline. Facing the Immortals wasn't simply facing potential death. It meant confronting an idea, an army that endured without hesitation or mercy. Being an Immortal wasn't just a role. It was a lifelong identity, a mark of status, and in some ways, a sentence. While honored and well compensated, these men lived under constant scrutiny. Food, clothing, and shelter were all state-provided, not out of generosity, but to maintain absolute control. From the moment of enlistment, they belonged to the Empire, not their families. Most Immortals descended from Persian, Median, or Elamite nobility, though lower-ranking sons of loyal households could occasionally rise through the ranks by demonstrating exceptional discipline. Training often began in childhood, within military academies connected to the royal court. Boys learned mounted archery, how to endure hunger and pain, how to march in perfect step, and, most importantly, how to obey without hesitation. Standing out too much wasn't rewarded. It was corrected. Formation and unity mattered above individual glory. Their daily lives followed strict routine, waking before dawn, drilling in silence, maintaining weapons and armor. Meals were communal, modest, and nutritionally calculated for endurance rather than indulgence. Bread, dates, meat, and wine were staples, while luxuries were actively discouraged. The Empire needed disciplined warriors, not pampered nobles. When not deployed on campaign, Immortals guarded the king and his court, but their duties extended well beyond ceremony. They watched for assassination plots, monitored courtiers for signs of disloyalty, and maintained order in the Empire's most unstable regions. Their mere presence could silence dissent in a royal hall. Some historians describe their function as resembling an early intelligence network, a constant, unspoken reminder that loyalty wasn't optional. Interestingly, Immortals weren't entirely cut off from personal life. They could marry and maintain households, but when summoned, they left everything behind without question. Hesitation, even once, could mean quiet replacement, because the number always had to remain exactly 10,000, without gaps or delays. This cold, efficient system is precisely what fueled their mythology. They didn't simply fight with discipline, they lived by it, shaped and sharpened into instruments of empire until little remained but duty. If Cyrus the Great created the immortals, it was Darius the Great who refined them into something even more formidable. When Darius seized power in 522 BCE amid palace intrigue and assassination plots, the immortals became central to legitimizing and stabilizing his rule. No longer simply a royal guard, they became a direct extension of royal authority, woven into the very structure of his expanding imperial bureaucracy. Darius understood that power wasn't built on military might alone, but on the perception of order and inevitability, and nothing conveyed that more effectively than the immortals. He paraded them at festivals, stationed them prominently throughout his new capital of Persepolis, and sent them on prominent diplomatic missions. They were always visible, always composed, always presented as the same eternal 10,000 faces of Persian dominance. Darius also reshaped their tactical purpose. Under his leadership, the immortals became central to Persia's combined arms warfare strategy. No longer just elite infantry, but a coordinated force working alongside archers, cavalry, and chariots. Because Darius placed heavy emphasis on strategic flexibility, the immortals adapted through rigorous training in ranged combat, siege tactics, and battlefield coordination. Later, Greek accounts describe them advancing with chilling efficiency, firing volleys of arrows while steadily moving forward behind wicker shields, never once breaking formation. They also played a key role in suppressing rebellions across an empire that stretched from Egypt to the Indus Valley, where uprisings were frequent. The immortals were often the first response, serving as both punishment and message. The empire is always watching, and the king's authority never runs dry. Under Darius, they gained a darker reputation as instruments of fear as much as warfare. Even their imagery evolved. Carvings at Persepolis show them in perfectly uniform rows, stylized and identical, facing eternity in stone. These weren't casual portraits. They were propaganda, meant to remind every subject and visitor alike that these men were always present, always armed, and, symbolically, unable to die. Step out of line, and you might encounter 1 or 10,000. Through Darius, the immortals transformed into more than a military unit. They became institutionalized fear, embedded directly into royal imagery and deployed with calculated precision. The immortals reached the height of their fame during the reign of Xerxes the Great, and nowhere was their legend tested more fiercely than at the narrow mountain pass of Thermopylae in 480 BCE. This battle, later mythologized through centuries of art and film, wasn't merely a military clash. It represented a symbolic collision between two vastly different worldviews: Persian imperial order versus Greek city-state defiance. And at the heart of that clash stood the immortals. When Xerxes launched his invasion of Greece with what ancient sources describe as the largest army the world had ever seen, he brought the immortals along as his personal vanguard. They didn't simply protect him. They functioned like a scalpel cutting through chaos. Their reputation alone preceded them. Greek forces had already heard tales of the 10,000 who never died. Elite soldiers who served kings almost as gods and fought with unmatched precision. At Thermopylae, though, they met resistance that shook that mythology. King Leonidas and his small Greek force, most famously 300 Spartans, held the narrow pass against wave after wave of Persian assault. On the battle's second day, Xerxes ordered the immortals forward to break the Greek line, expecting a swift and decisive victory from his most elite troops. But what unfolded wasn't the instant rout Xerxes anticipated. Constrained by the tight terrain of the pass, the immortals found their bows nearly useless in such confined space, and their shorter spears couldn't match the reach of the Greek hoplites' longer weapons. For hours, they clashed against disciplined Spartans trained from childhood specifically for this style of tightly packed combat. The immortals suffered heavy losses. Herodotus even noted with a hint of irony that they fared no better than the ordinary Persian troops. It wasn't just a tactical setback. It fractured their carefully cultivated image. The immortals had always appeared untouchable, almost godlike in their silk and armor. At Thermopylae, they bled, they died, and for the first time, the illusion of their invincibility cracked under Spartan spears and unwavering Greek resistance. Yet even in defeat, they remained formidable. They regrouped, adapted, and marched onward. Immortality, it turned out, was never really about being unbeatable. It was about enduring. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of the Persian immortals wasn't their training or battlefield tactics at all. It was their administrative system. What truly made them immortal wasn't magic or divine favor, but cold, relentless bureaucratic efficiency. When one immortal fell, whether in combat, from illness, or through retirement, another stepped into his place instantly. No ceremony, no delay, just a seamless substitution. The total always remained exactly 10,000. This wasn't poetic exaggeration. It was intentional design. The Achaemenid Empire ran on logistics, and the Immortals stood as its finest example. A constantly maintained pool of trainees and understudies existed specifically to fill vacancies the moment they appeared. Young men groomed, supervised, and drilled in the capital, rotating through minor duties while awaiting the call. This internal structure elevated the Immortals from a static elite unit into a living, ever-regenerating system of excellence. Meticulous records supported this machinery, overseen by officers called Hazarapatis, literally, commanders of 1,000. 10 such commanders operated beneath the unit's overall leader, supported by a network of subordinate officers, scribes, and quartermasters ensuring every soldier had proper weapons, rations, lodging, and medical care. Lose a soldier in Egypt, and a replacement was dispatched from Susa. A man injured on patrol in Media had his successor already preparing to depart. This machinery extended well beyond battlefield readiness. It carried psychological weight, too. The illusion of 10,000 unchanging warriors served as a powerful tool of imperial intimidation. Kill one, and another instantly stood in his place. Individual identity became almost irrelevant. What mattered was the unbroken presence. Even away from the battlefield, this system operated flawlessly. If an Immortal's family fell under political suspicion or disloyalty, he was quietly removed and replaced, without scandal or disruption. The formation simply continued, as though nothing had changed. This mechanism, so different from the individual glory-seeking culture of Greek warriors, may have been the Immortals' greatest strength. Not raw skill, not even courage, but the cold certainty that the unit itself could never truly disappear. While remembered primarily as warriors, the Immortals also served a subtler role, as diplomats in armor. Within the Achaemenid worldview, military force wasn't solely about conquest. It was about presence. The Immortals were frequently deployed not just to fight, but to be seen, appearing in foreign courts as living representations of Persian elegance and power. Their silk robes, gilded weapons, and flawless discipline made them terrifying in war, yet mesmerizing in times of peace. When ambassadors traveled to foreign lands, Immortals often accompanied them, not strictly for protection, but as a form of spectacle. Picture a small elite escort entering a Greek or Babylonian city. A handful of men perfectly synchronized, dressed not in rough leather or blood-stained bronze, but in fine, gold-threaded tunics, silent and unreadable behind their soft felt headwear. They rarely needed to shout or threaten. Their very presence functioned as negotiation. Across the empire's provinces, Immortals were regularly stationed as a reminder of where true authority resided. They typically avoided interfering with local governance, but their constant presence loomed over it. Even a whisper of rebellion could bring a squad of them to a governor's doorstep, and often the mere threat of their arrival was enough to prevent uprisings before they began. Within the royal court itself, their role extended beyond ceremonial duty during festivals, coronations, and diplomatic events. Behind the scenes, they monitored courtiers, detected treachery, and enforced royal will with quiet efficiency. Some historians even compare their function to an early form of internal intelligence, a constant unspoken warning that loyalty was never optional. This dual identity, warrior and envoy, enforcer and ornament, was central to their effectiveness. Unlike many elite units of the ancient world, who existed purely for battlefield glory, the Immortals served a much wider imperial strategy, in which warfare was only one tool among many. Theirs was an empire held together as much by symbolism as by weapons. The Immortals understood that fear and awe often walk hand in hand. In distant courts and remote palaces, their arrival delivered a clear message. The king is watching. The empire endures, and resistance simply isn't worth the cost. In that sense, they fought entire wars without ever drawing a blade. Every empire eventually ages, and so does its mythology. In the later years of the Achaemenid Empire, the Immortals remained feared and respected, but no longer untouchable. The machinery that once made them seem eternal began to erode, not through dramatic collapse, but through slow, creeping inefficiency. As Persian kings grew increasingly distant from the battlefield, more focused on courtly luxury and political intrigue, the Immortals gradually shifted from hardened soldiers into ceremonial figures. Under rulers like Artaxerxes and Darius III, the elite guard still existed, still dressed the part, still marched in flawless formation, but cracks had formed beneath the surface. Recruitment standards loosened, and political favoritism crept into the ranks. Where once only the most disciplined and loyal men earned a place among the 10,000, now noble families pulled strings to place unqualified sons within the ranks. The result was subtle, but ultimately fatal. Uniformity without genuine spirit. Discipline without heart. This decline became painfully clear when Alexander the Great launched his invasion of Persia in 334 BCE. At the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BCE, the Immortals were positioned alongside the Persian center to defend Darius III. Though they fought with genuine courage, they could not withstand the tactical brilliance and relentless momentum of Alexander's Macedonian phalanxes. They were outflanked, outmaneuvered, and ultimately overwhelmed. Worse still, their legend didn't survive the encounter. For centuries, the name Immortals had inspired awe. But Gaugamela proved they were no longer the force they'd been under Cyrus or Xerxes. The once flawless replacement system had faltered. The mechanism that had made their losses invisible was simply no longer functioning. The unit never fully recovered. When Alexander later entered Persepolis and claimed the royal palace, he walked into the remnants of an empire the Immortals were no longer present to defend. The once unbroken line had finally shattered. But their story didn't end there. Elements of Persian military tradition were absorbed into Alexander's own forces, and later, under the Sasanian Empire, a new elite unit emerged, sometimes referred to by historians as New Immortals. Though not direct descendants, they echoed the original legacy. 10,000 strong, elite, and framed as eternal. Even in their fall, the original Immortals left behind a blueprint, demonstrating to the world how to construct not merely an army, but an enduring legend. Long after the Achaemenid Empire fell, the concept of an unbreakable elite fighting force remained embedded in the imaginations of generals, monarchs, and storytellers. Their legend persisted not because they won every battle, but because they represented something larger, the perfected image of state-controlled power, an army that never aged, never questioned, and never faltered. When Greek writers described them, it was with a mixture of awe and suspicion. Herodotus called them immortals, not because they were literally unkillable, but because their deaths were never allowed to be visible. Replacements arrived instantly, their presence perpetually intact. To the Greeks, accustomed to war as a chaotic, deeply personal affair, this precision felt almost unnatural, faceless, disciplined nearly beyond the boundaries of ordinary humanity. Roman scholars continued referencing the immortals whenever discussing ancient concepts of power, and Byzantine historians noted the structural genius of the Persian elite guard as something worth studying and admiring. Even early Islamic-era historians recounted tales of the 10,000 who once guarded ancient kings, their spears gleaming like a forest of silver beneath the desert sun. The concept resurfaced again under the Sasanian Empire, where an elite armored cavalry corps, sometimes called the New Immortals by later historians, served as the empire's iron fist. Though not a direct continuation of the Achaemenid unit, they carried forward the same core mission, projecting imperial invincibility. Even centuries later, Napoleon Bonaparte reportedly studied Persian military organization and admired its underlying structure. Culturally, the immortals seeped into legend and myth. Modern media often distorts them into monsters, masked assassins, or supernatural figures, but the reality was far more compelling. They were human, remarkably and unmistakably human. Ordinary men transformed into instruments of empire through relentless training, psychological discipline, and a deeply embedded system built for continuity. They didn't require magic to achieve legendary status, only consistency and silence. Their greatest weapon was never really their weaponry. It was the idea that they were always coming, an eternal shadow lingering on the horizon. And so, the immortals live on, carved into stone, embedded in military doctrine, and echoed in the quiet fears of anyone who understands that power. When organized with enough precision and endlessly renewed, can come remarkably close to true immortality. Long before the Greek myth of the Amazons took shape, there were the Scythians, nomadic warriors of the Eurasian steppe, feared and respected from the Black Sea all the way to the Altai Mountains. Unlike most ancient societies, Scythian women didn't remain behind in the tents, weaving cloth or tending children. They rode horses, wielded bows, and rode into battle, not simply as companions to male warriors, but as leaders and fighters in their own right. This wasn't an occasional exception. It was woven into the culture itself. Greek historians, including Herodotus, were astonished when they encountered these women. He described entire tribes in which women reportedly refused to marry until they had killed an enemy in combat. What once read as exotic exaggeration has since been backed by archaeological evidence. Burial mounds known as kurgans, scattered across Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and southern Russia, have revealed the remains of young women buried alongside bows, arrows, swords, and even injuries consistent with battle. One notable discovery uncovered a woman with an arrowhead embedded in her spine, her body clad in armor, her grave filled with rich burial goods. These weren't ceremonial weapons. They had clearly seen use, and so had she. Scythian society differed fundamentally from its neighbors. Life on the steppe demanded constant mobility and resilience, and everyone, regardless of gender, was expected to ride, hunt, and defend the community. Girls learned archery as early as boys did, wore similar leather trousers and armor, and even styled their hair and tattoos in comparable fashion, making it difficult to distinguish gender on horseback amid a storm of arrows. This created a warrior culture where gender roles remained flexible on the battlefield, but far more rigid off it. A Scythian woman might be a deadly force at full gallop, then return home to fulfill ceremonial and maternal responsibilities, roles that weren't seen as conflicting, but complementary. Greek myths of Amazon warriors may well have drawn inspiration from exaggerated encounters with Scythian women. But while the Amazons of legend faded into fantasy, the Scythians were undeniably real. They battled Persians, clashed with Greeks, and struck fear into the Macedonians, and for centuries they roamed the steppe with a reputation few dared to challenge. Men and women fighting side by side. In the small West African kingdom of Dahomey, in what is now Benin, an all-female army once struck fear into European colonizers, rival kingdoms, and anyone foolish enough to underestimate them. Known as the Agoji, though nicknamed the Dahomey Amazons by French observers drawing comparisons to Greek myth, these warriors were entirely real. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the Agoji had become Dahomey's standing royal guard. But they were far more than ceremonial protectors. They functioned as elite infantry, trained to defend, to kill, and to never retreat. While some historians believe the unit may have originated among elephant hunters or palace attendants, over time it evolved into a formal, deeply feared military force. Recruited from a young age, often selected for physical strength or a fierce spirit, Agoji recruits were separated from their families and placed into intense training. Discipline was absolute. They ran obstacle courses lined with thorns, practiced with real blades, and swore oaths of celibacy and complete loyalty to the king. They wore braided sashes and carried muskets, machetes, and clubs, though their most effective weapon may have been psychological. European observers during the 19th century were reportedly stunned by their fearlessness and brutality in combat. One French officer described watching a Dahomey warrior charge forward, strike down an opponent, and calmly wipe her blade clean afterward. These weren't symbolic soldiers. They were genuine frontline fighters used in raids, battles, and ambushes. During the Franco-Dahomean Wars of the 1890s, the Agoji fought directly against French colonial troops. Despite being outnumbered and outgunned, they launched night raids, staged ambushes, and fought street by street in defense of their kingdom. Their resilience forced French commanders to reconsider both their tactics and their assumptions about women in warfare. But their significance extended beyond battlefield success. Existing within a deeply patriarchal society, the Agoji nonetheless carved out genuine autonomy and influence, advising kings, performing ceremonial duties, and directly shaping the kingdom's foreign policy, blade in hand rather than from the sidelines. Although France ultimately defeated Dahomey, the legend of the Agoji never faded. Their legacy even helped inspire modern fictional warriors, such as the Dora Milaje in Marvel's Black Panther, though, as always, the true history remains even more remarkable than fiction. In the shadowed pages of medieval Japanese history rides one particularly striking figure, Tomoe Gozen, a samurai warrior active in the late 12th century. She fought during the Genpei War, a brutal civil conflict between the Minamoto and Taira clans that ultimately gave rise to Japan's first shogunate. Tomoe wasn't a symbolic or decorative figure. She served as a commander, a skilled swordswoman, and a trained archer, feared for her precision in combat. Her story is preserved most famously in the Heike Monogatari, an epic war chronicle blending history with poetic embellishment. In it, Tomoe is described as remarkably beautiful, with pale skin, long hair, and striking features. But the text immediately pivots to something far more significant. She was also an exceptionally skilled archer, and, as a swordswoman, considered a warrior worth 1,000 ordinary soldiers. Beauty and lethal skill weren't treated as contradictions. They coexisted. Tomoe served under Minamoto no Yoshinaka, a warlord and possibly her romantic partner, during his campaign to seize Kyoto. She wasn't a camp attendant or battlefield nurse. She was directly involved in combat, reportedly leading troops and defeating multiple opponents in single combat. At the Battle of Owazu in 1184, facing encirclement by rival Minamoto forces, Yoshinaka prepared for his final stand. Rather than retreat, Tomo chose to fight. In one of her most famous recorded moments, she is said to have unseated a charging enemy horseman, wrestled him to the ground, and beheaded him on the spot, before calmly remounting and continuing into battle. That moment, whether historically precise or slightly embellished over centuries, has endured as a lasting symbol of her composure and skill. What happened to Tomo after the war remains uncertain. Some accounts claim she was captured and forced into marriage. Others suggest she became a nun, withdrawing into a quiet life. Still others say she vanished entirely, absorbed into legend. Regardless of the truth, her legacy has persisted through theater, folklore, and cultural memory. In a society built on strict gender roles and patriarchal control, Tomo Gozen stood apart, sword drawn, head held high, and entirely unafraid. She wasn't only fighting on behalf of her lord. She was asserting her right to exist in a world that insisted she shouldn't. In the 1st century CE, the Roman Empire stood at the height of its power, disciplined, expansive, and seemingly unstoppable. Then came a fiery Celtic queen from Britannia who very nearly brought that formidable machine to its knees. Her name would go down in history as a symbol of righteous vengeance, national pride, and the devastating force of a woman with nothing left to lose. Boudica was married to Prasutagus, king of the Iceni tribe in what is now eastern England. As a client king under Roman rule, he was permitted to retain power so long as peace was maintained. But upon his death, Rome disregarded his will and moved to seize his territory outright. In the process, Roman officials publicly flogged Boudica and, according to the historian Tacitus, assaulted her daughters, a calculated act of humiliation meant to suppress any resistance. Instead, it ignited a firestorm. In 60 or 61 CE, Boudica united several British tribes and launched one of the fiercest uprisings in Roman history. She wasn't merely a symbolic leader. Roman accounts describe her personally commanding her forces from a chariot, spear in hand, dressed in a flowing tunic with a large gold torque around her neck, fiery hair streaming behind her as she rallied her people into war. Part priestess, part general, entirely driven by fury, she led her army in burning Camulodunum, modern-day Colchester, to the ground. Londinium followed, the early foundation of modern London, where Roman colonists and sympathizers were slaughtered and the city razed. Historians estimate that tens of thousands of Romans and their allies were killed within a matter of months, leaving devastation and shattered confidence in her army's wake. Eventually, Roman forces under Governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus regrouped. Despite being significantly outnumbered, disciplined Roman formation tactics proved decisive in a pitched battle that Boudica's forces were lured into. Her rebellion was ultimately crushed, and facing certain defeat, Boudica is believed to have taken her own life rather than be captured. Though her uprising failed militarily, her legacy only grew stronger over time. Roman historians portrayed her as a fearsome outsider, yet one whose courage and leadership proved impossible to dismiss. For the British, particularly in later centuries, she came to symbolize resistance against tyranny, whether foreign or domestic. In the war-torn steppes of Central Asia, during the height of Mongol expansion, one woman became legendary, not primarily for wielding a sword, but for her sheer physical dominance in wrestling. Her name was Kutulun, great-great-granddaughter of Genghis Khan himself. Yet she carved her own legacy, rather than living purely in his shadow. Born around 1260 CE, Kutulun was the daughter of Kaidu Khan, a powerful cousin of Kublai Khan and a rival claimant to Mongol leadership. Raised much like a warrior prince, she trained extensively in archery, horsemanship, and battlefield tactics. But she became most renowned for her mastery of wrestling, a deeply respected and fiercely competitive sport within Mongol culture. According to Persian historian Rashid al-Din, Kutulun vowed she would only marry a man capable of defeating her in a wrestling match. Countless suitors attempted it. All failed. Some historical accounts suggest she accumulated as many as 10,000 horses from these victories, transforming her not only into a celebrated champion, but also one of the wealthiest women on the steppe. Cuchulain's skills weren't confined to sport, however. She fought alongside her father in genuine battles, commanding troops and breaking through enemy formations. During campaigns against rival Mongol factions and Chinese forces, she served as Kaidu's most trusted military advisor, to the extent that he reportedly considered naming her his successor. An almost unprecedented move within a heavily male-dominated warrior culture. Unsurprisingly, this sparked resistance among Mongol nobility, some of whom viewed her influence and power as unnatural or threatening. Ultimately, Kaidu chose a male relative as his heir instead. Still, her reputation endured. Even Marco Polo, who traveled through the Mongol Empire, described a Mongol princess who fought like a tiger and could ride and shoot as skillfully as any man. Later historical accounts sometimes attempted to romanticize her story, softening it into tales of romance or reducing her achievements to legend. But Cuchulainn was undeniably real, and her strength was, quite literally, legendary. She proved that even within the most male-dominated empire in the world, a woman could rise, not because she was permitted to, but because no one was capable of stopping her. At a time when women couldn't vote, own property freely, or even wear men's clothing without risking arrest. One French teenager didn't just wear armor, she led armies. Joan of Arc, born in 1412 in the small village of Domremy, was an illiterate peasant girl. Yet by the age of 17, she was commanding troops, confronting kings, and reshaping the course of the 100 Years' War between France and England. Her rise wasn't rooted in formal military training or noble birth. Joan claimed divine guidance, saying she heard the voices of saints, including Michael, Catherine, and Margaret, instructing her that she'd been chosen to drive the English from France and see Charles the Dauphin crowned king. It was an audacious claim, one that easily could have gotten her dismissed outright. Instead, it secured her an audience with the future King Charles VII. Clergy interrogated her for weeks, testing her sincerity and knowledge. And somehow, she passed. They saw something in her. Conviction, presence, something difficult to explain. Clad in white armor, banner held high, Joan was dispatched to Orléans, a besieged city symbolizing a critical turning point in the war. French commanders were understandably skeptical, but Joan's presence reinvigorated their morale. She didn't simply stand at the sidelines. She led charges, braved incoming arrows, and rallied troops under direct fire. Against overwhelming odds, the siege of Orléans was lifted. The victory electrified the nation, and Joan became known as the Maid of Orléans, a symbol of divine favor and national resistance. Following a series of further victories, she escorted Charles to Reims, where he was crowned king, exactly as she claimed her voices had foretold. But power, fame, and reported miracles inevitably attract enemies. In 1430, Joan was captured by Burgundian forces allied with the English. Tried before a pro-English ecclesiastical court, she was accused of heresy, witchcraft, and, notably, wearing men's clothing, a crime punishable by death at the time. She was just 19 years old when she was burned at the stake in the marketplace of Rouen. But her death only amplified her legend. Years later, the church reversed her conviction, and centuries after that, she was formally canonized as a saint. By the time took up her naginata, a bladed pole weapon favored by samurai women, Japan was rapidly changing. It was the late 1860s, and the samurai class was being systematically dismantled as the country pushed toward modernization. But in one final defiant stand for tradition, this young woman would carve her name into history as the last true Onimusha, or female warrior, of the samurai era. Nakano was born in 1847 into a respected family of scholars and warriors. From an early age, she studied Confucian classics, calligraphy, and, crucially, martial arts. Her weapon of choice, the naginata, was more than a practical tool. It carried deep symbolic weight, traditionally associated with women of samurai lineage, allowing for extended reach and fluid, graceful combat technique. Under the guidance of her adoptive father and martial arts instructor, she trained relentlessly until her skill rivaled that of the finest warriors in her domain. By her 20s, Nakano had become both an educator and a warrior, teaching martial technique to other women. But in 1868, when the Boshin War erupted, a civil conflict pitting imperial forces against the old Tokugawa shogunate, Nakano didn't remain on the sidelines. She joined the defense of Aizu, one of the last major strongholds of traditional samurai resistance. Although women weren't officially permitted to serve in combat, Nakano formed an unofficial fighting unit known as the Joshitai, or Women's Army. Dressed in traditional hakama and armor, these women fought fiercely alongside male defenders, protecting their families, city, and way of life. At the Battle of Aizu, Nakano led her unit into direct hand-to-hand combat against imperial troops armed with rifles. According to witness accounts, she managed to strike down several opponents before being fatally shot in the chest. Recognizing she wouldn't survive and unwilling to be captured or dishonored, she reportedly asked her sister to behead her. She was later buried at a temple in Fukushima, her sword placed beside her. Nakano's bravery became legendary even in defeat. Statues honoring her stand throughout Japan today, particularly in Aizu, where she's remembered not just as a fierce warrior, but as a woman who refused to yield to modernity, patriarchy, or death itself. In the smoldering aftermath of World War II, one name struck genuine fear into German soldiers stationed along the Eastern Front: Lyudmila Pavlichenko, nicknamed Lady Death by her enemies. She wasn't myth, propaganda, or morale-boosting fiction. She was very real. A Soviet sniper credited with 309 confirmed kills, including 36 enemy snipers, she remains the most lethal female sniper in recorded history. Born in 1916 in what is now Ukraine, Pavlichenko showed competitiveness and marksmanship talent from a young age, alongside fierce patriotism. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, she was just 24 years old, studying history at university. Rather than continuing her studies, she picked up a rifle and volunteered for the Red Army. Officials initially suggested she take on a nursing role instead. She refused, insisting on a combat position, and eventually earned one. Deployed to the front lines during the sieges of Odessa and later Sevastopol, Pavlichenko built her formidable reputation through patience and precision, spending long hours motionless, camouflaged in freezing conditions, waiting for the perfect shot. Her targets extended beyond ordinary infantry to include officers, machine gunners, and rival snipers. She combined nerves of steel, near supernatural patience, and an intense determination against the invading forces. As her kill count climbed, she was eventually pulled from frontline duty and sent on a diplomatic tour across the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom, where she met President Franklin D. Roosevelt and developed a genuine friendship with Eleanor Roosevelt, who admired her composure and sharp intellect. Pavlichenko delivered speeches urging Allied leaders to open a second front in Europe, while famously brushing off reporters who asked her dismissive, sexist questions about makeup and skirt length. After the war, she didn't fade into obscurity. She completed her university degree, became a historian, and later trained future generations of Soviet snipers. Though she struggled with war-related trauma and lasting injuries, her legacy remained firmly intact. She was awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union and continues to be honored as a national hero in both Russia and Ukraine. In a world that has often questioned women's place in warfare, Lyudmila Pavlichenko never needed to argue or protest her worth. She simply performed the job better than almost anyone else in history ever has. For every widely recognized name, Boudica, Tomoe Gozen, Lyudmila Pavlichenko, countless other stories have slipped through the cracks of mainstream history. History, after all, has largely been written by men, And when women picked up swords, rifles, or spears, their contributions were often minimized, ignored, or reshaped into myth. But make no mistake, warrior women have existed across every continent and era, and their silence throughout history was never voluntary. Consider the Trung sisters of Vietnam, Trung Trac and Trung Nhi, who led a rebellion against Chinese occupation in the 1st century CE. They rode elephants into battle, rallied thousands of supporters, and governed an independent state for 3 years before eventually being defeated by superior Chinese forces. Their resistance is still commemorated today through temples and festivals in Vietnam, even though global history books rarely mention them. There's also Ya Asantewaa of the Ashanti Empire in West Africa, who in 1900 led a rebellion against British colonial forces. As Queen Mother, she rallied her people when the British demanded the sacred golden stool, the symbol of Ashanti sovereignty. She delivered powerful speeches and personally led her troops into battle, proving that leadership and defiance recognized no gender boundaries. Viking shield maidens, too, likely weren't as widespread as legend suggests, but archaeological evidence confirms they very much existed. Women buried alongside weapons, armor, and even war horses, not as ceremonial gestures, but as genuine warriors. And in the American Southwest, Apache fighters like Lozan, a respected spiritual warrior, rode and fought alongside her brother, the famed leader Victorio, across every era and region. Warrior women fought, not always to conquer, but often simply to protect their families, cultures, and homes. Some commanded armies, others resisted as solitary figures within larger movements. Some were queens, others common villagers. But all of them shattered the persistent myth that warfare belonged exclusively to men. Today, their legacies are steadily being reclaimed, from academic research to popular culture, and every rediscovered name serves as a reminder. History isn't only what was written down, it's also what was deliberately erased. These women never asked to be remembered. They asked to be respected. And gradually, the world is beginning to listen. In the heart of ancient Mesopotamia, in what is now Iraq, music wasn't mere entertainment. It functioned as ritual, power, and language all at once. No instrument embodied this more fully than the lyre. Among the earliest known stringed instruments, the Mesopotamian lyre dates back more than 4,500 years, emerging from the Sumerian city of Ur, where music was deeply woven into both temple ceremony and royal court life. These lyres weren't simple wooden harps. They were intricately crafted objects, often adorned with gold, silver, lapis, and detailed animal carvings. One of the most famous surviving examples is the bull-headed lyre, uncovered in a royal tomb during the 1920s by archaeologist Sir Leonard Woolley. Its soundbox was shaped like a bull's body, its head covered in gold leaf, its beard crafted from lapis lazuli. This wasn't purely decorative. The bull symbolized strength, and its presence on the instrument likely carried spiritual, rather than merely aesthetic, meaning, played using fingers or a small plectrum. The lyre produced a rich, resonant tone. While we can't hear ancient melodies exactly as they were performed, scholars believe the Sumerians used a 7-note scale similar in structure to modern Western music. Clay tablets inscribed with early musical notation offer tantalizing clues, suggesting that concepts of music theory and scale construction existed even at this early stage. These lyres weren't confined solely to palace halls either. In temples, music accompanied offerings and prayers to deities like Inanna and Enlil, positioning music as a sacred bridge connecting humanity and the divine. Some accounts suggest lyres were even played to mourn the dead, guiding souls into the afterlife. They weren't merely instruments. They served as voices of transition and transformation. Mesopotamian musicians held respected societal roles. Some were priestesses, others court performers, memorizing complex compositions passed down orally. often trained from childhood within structured scribal and musical schools. Today, reconstructed replicas of these ancient lyres are played in museums, their gentle, resonant tones reminding us that long before Mozart, medieval troubadours, or even Homer's epic poetry, humans were already plucking strings in pursuit of beauty and sound. While the lyre offered gentle melodies to the gods, the aulos screamed, wept, and danced through the emotional core of ancient Greek life. This reed-driven, double-piped wind instrument was anything but a gentle flute. It was wild, intensely emotional, and unrestrained. To the Greeks, music wasn't purely entertainment. It was ethos, a force capable of shaping the soul, and the aulos represented its most primal, untamed edge. Unlike the lyre, associated with harmony, order, and the god Apollo, the aulos was linked to Dionysus, god of wine, ecstasy, and chaos. It was frequently played during rituals, theatrical performances, and military processions, giving it an unusually wide range of emotional and practical uses. The instrument consisted of two separate pipes, typically crafted from wood, bone, or ivory, each fitted with its own reed and set of finger holes. Musicians played both pipes simultaneously, producing a dense, penetrating sound closer to bagpipes than a modern flute. This required extraordinary breath control, often achieved through circular breathing, inhaling through the nose while continuously pushing air out through the cheeks, allowing uninterrupted, continuous play. The physical effort visibly strained musicians' faces, puffing their cheeks so dramatically that some athletes reportedly mocked aulos players for their unusual appearance. Despite this teasing, skilled aulos players were genuinely respected, even revered in certain circles. The aulos was never meant for calm background ambiance. In Greek theater, it accompanied tragedies and comedies alike, adding mood and momentum to performances by playwrights like Sophocles and Euripides. On the battlefield, it helped keep hoplite soldiers marching in coordinated step, its sharp tone cutting through the surrounding chaos. And during Bacchic rituals, it drove dancers into trance-like states, blurring the boundary between performer and possessed participant. Plato held a complicated view of the instrument. In his Republic, he famously dismissed the aulos as too emotionally overwhelming, favoring instruments like the lyre and kithara for their perceived intellectual clarity. Hey everyone! Tonight, we're diving into the strange, ambitious, and occasionally eyebrowless world of medieval beauty standards. A world where the aim wasn't to look healthy, but to look like someone who'd just calmly fainted from exertion. Before you settle in, take a second to like this video and subscribe, but only if you're actually enjoying the content. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. It's always fun to see how far and wide this audience stretches. Now dim the lights, maybe click on a fan for that soft white noise, and let's sink into tonight's story together. In the medieval world, having pale skin wasn't a sign you needed more rest. It was a fashion choice, a status symbol, a quiet announcement to everyone around you that said, "I am far too wealthy to ever set foot in sunlight. Thank you very much." Unlike today, where a sun-kissed glow might suggest yoga, smoothies, or a beach getaway, medieval beauty worked in reverse. A tan meant outdoor labor, which meant poverty, which meant, gasp, actual physical work, and nothing screamed unattractive in the 14th century quite like knowing how to milk a cow. So the paler your skin, the higher your assumed rank in society. And when they said pale, they didn't mean a soft ivory tone. They meant nearly translucent, almost see-through skin with visible veins beneath. The kind of complexion that made you look like you'd just seen a ghost, or perhaps were one yourself. Naturally, biology doesn't always cooperate, especially when you're stuck with a functioning circulatory system. So people gave nature a hand. Noble women, and occasionally noblemen, dusted their faces with white lead powder, which delivered that coveted corpse-like sheen while quietly poisoning them in the process. But beauty has always demanded sacrifice. Some soaked cloths in vinegar and pressed them against their skin to bleach it. Others mixed crushed pearls with egg whites, a combination that lightened the complexion while leaving cheeks with the texture of a day-old omelet. Some even painted fake blue veins onto their arms and chest to suggest fragility, because apparently nothing signals nobility quite like pretending your skin is on the verge of splitting open. Literature joined the trend too. Love poems described women as pale as milk, white as snow, and in one memorable case, as pale as the winter moon, which is really just a poetic way of saying she looked like she might collapse. This obsession with pallor wasn't only about looks. It was code for class, purity, and total detachment from farm labor. If you could afford to look breakable, you were winning. Achieving that prized ghostly complexion in the Middle Ages usually meant more than good genetics. It meant a slow, decorative brush with chemical poisoning. When nature alone wasn't enough, people turned to lead-based white face powder. Yes, the same substance we now cordon off in old buildings. Back then, though, it was considered the height of innovation. It gave the skin a flat, pale, matte finish. Essentially, the medieval version of full-coverage foundation, leaving the face looking flawless, and eventually feeling anything but. This powder was made by exposing metal to vinegar until it corroded into a white residue, which was then ground down into a fine dust. Apply it daily, and you'd achieve the look of a radiant aristocrat quietly signing up for a slow death. If your skin started peeling, blistering, or flaking away in small chunks, that was, somehow, taken as a sign the product was working, and the routine rarely stopped there. Many layered on mercury-based rouge for color, or chalk powder to help the base stick longer. Egg whites were smoothed over the face for extra shine. Basically, if it came from a barn or an alchemist's shelf, chances are someone had rubbed it on their face in pursuit of elegance. Beyond the obvious poisoning, lead cosmetics caused chronic exhaustion, skin sores, hair loss, and early death, none of which appear on modern skincare packaging. Yet the trend persisted, because when the alternative was being mistaken for a commoner, many nobles apparently preferred the slow route to the grave. Men weren't entirely exempt either. Some male courtiers, particularly in the later medieval and early Renaissance courts, used powders and skin treatments of their own. In eras where appearance mattered nearly as much as bloodline, or at least as much as smelling better than one's rivals. Of all the medieval beauty obsessions, the fixation on tall foreheads might be the most eyebrow-raising, quite literally, since people were plucking their eyebrows out entirely to achieve it. A tall, smooth, uninterrupted forehead wasn't just trendy. It was seen as elegant, intelligent, and even divine. The architectural centerpiece of a noble face. That kind of forehead announced, "I spend my time reading scripture and gazing thoughtfully from castle windows, not swinging a shovel." To reach this look, women went to extreme and often itchy lengths. Eyebrows were plucked away completely, and sometimes hair along the scalp was removed strand by strand to push the hairline further back. This wasn't a simple trim. It was a full forehead expansion campaign. Beauty guides of the era recommended tweezers, hot cloths, and depilatory pastes made from ingredients like cat dung, quicklime, or vinegar-soaked leeches, all in pursuit of a forehead spacious enough to host a jousting match. The results were unmistakable. Portraits from the period show women with calm expressions and foreheads so expansive. They seem to stretch endlessly. Paired with pale skin and delicate features, this high forehead look became a visual shorthand for refinement. Fashion supported the trend too. Fitted hoods, wimples, and those iconic cone-shaped henna hats all helped pull hair back or hide the spot where eyebrows used to be. This wasn't limited to one region. From England to France to Italy, Noblewomen embraced the tall forehead aesthetic, while poets and painters praised faces that seemed to begin near the crown of the head. Not everyone had the time or resources to pluck their way to perfection, though. Some women simply painted a higher hairline onto their skin and covered the rest with headbands or veils. In other words, the Middle Ages had their own version of contouring. It just required a great deal more fabric. In medieval Europe, eyebrows weren't just overlooked. They were deliberately erased. While modern beauty culture celebrates thick, sculpted brows and endless online tutorials, in the 14th and 15th centuries, eyebrows were treated as unwanted facial clutter. To hit the ideal look, women plucked their brows down to almost nothing, or removed them entirely. The reasoning was simple. A smooth, bare forehead was considered graceful, and any stray hairs disrupted that clean look. Eyebrows were essentially treated like weeds sprouting in an otherwise manicured garden. Some women went even further, shaving the brow area completely to guarantee not a single hair interrupted their pale, glowing forehead. It's the kind of dedication that would make today's beauty influencers pause, especially since there were no eyebrow pencils around to fix any regrets. Removal methods included tweezers, pumice stones, wax, or, for the truly daring, pastes containing quicklime, vinegar, or even arsenic. Nothing quite says commitment to a look like risking chemical burns to your face. This wasn't a fleeting trend either. Illuminated manuscripts and oil paintings from the era consistently show noble women with smooth foreheads and expressionless eyes, framed by nothing but bare skin. A look that reads as either serene or faintly unsettling depending on the lighting. Interestingly, the trend wasn't uniform across all of Europe. In some regions, thin or lightly arched brows remained in fashion, especially where Byzantine and Middle Eastern influences filtered in through trade and conflict. But broadly speaking, the message was clear. Visible eyebrows meant you were doing it wrong. Men occasionally groomed or trimmed their brows too, particularly those in courtly circles, though full removal was rare among them unless lost during some particularly intense theological argument. What all this reveals is that medieval beauty wasn't about looking natural. It was about looking deliberate, symbolic, and faintly angelic. After all, angels in religious art rarely have eyebrows. Coincidence, maybe, but it worked in their favor. A touch of color on the cheeks was desirable in medieval times, but as with everything else in medieval life, there were rules, risks, and a faint chance of spiritual condemnation attached. The ideal was a soft, natural-looking blush, as if you'd just heard a slightly scandalous poem or briefly stepped outside, but not long enough to actually tan. A gentle rosy tint suggested youth, fertility, and general good health, all appealing qualities, particularly if maintained past the ripe old age of 28. The catch was that you couldn't look like you were trying. Wearing rouge was seen as vain, and vanity sat uncomfortably close to sin. The church wasn't thrilled about women adding color to their faces, unless, of course, they were nobility, or managed to do it with enough humility. A theological loophole scholars still debate. Still, women found ways around it. Common blush ingredients included beetroot juice, crushed strawberries, mulberries, or a deep red dye made from crushed insects. Yes, actual bugs, because beauty routines have never been squeamish. Some simply rubbed their cheeks to bring blood to the surface, while others dabbed on red ochre or wine sediment carefully, hoping to avoid the notice of both clergy and gossiping neighbors.